Vesanto. It is so lovely to get a chance to have you on the Allsorts podcast.
You too, Desiree. Yeah, we've been dietitians for a long time now.
We have, and I think, particularly for me, I have looked up to your work for literally as long as I have been a dietitian, and so I'm really excited to share you with my audience because you have been a plant-based dietitian since before that was a thing.
That's right. Well, first I went to India in the 70s, and people in India really know how to do vegetarian very well. It's been, a long tradition for many, many centuries, millennia. And then I came back and was started sharing this. I'd been teaching at UBC, and I started sharing it with the public and with dietitians, and in the process became vegan myself. And so that was like 1993 with our first book. And I realized that we could manage without dairy products, which at that time were an essential food group on the Canada Food Guide. And I wasn't saying it was a bad thing. I was just saying you can manage without it. In fact, 70% of the world's population does manage without dairy or has some kind of reaction if they eat it, lactose intolerance. So anyway, it was just a long evolution of understanding different options. And I've had the advantage of eating in so many different ways that I can help people, wherever they are in the spectrum, do so in really good health.
And your books, Becoming Vegetarian, Becoming Vegan, those books are really sort of essential reading for anyone who wants to deeply understand what it means to be nourished on a plant based diet. And, I have to remind folks that in 1993, exactly what you said to say, hey, maybe we don't need dairy. Like, fine if you're going to consume it, but like, maybe we don't need it was like absolutely a controversial statement as a dietitian.
Was. And the Dairy Farmers of Canada wrote a 45-page booklet against our book and gave it out across Canada. I was kind of shocked, but it actually made our book a bestseller, or helped to do that. Our Becoming Vegetarian, that was done back then, became very popular, with kind of controversy surrounding it. And all we were saying was, hey, you can get the calcium, the protein, the riboflavin, all the different nutrients from other places too. And here's what they are. So anyway, it's been quite an interesting journey.
Well, and you continue to innovate and drive that conversation forward because I think just like so many of us equated getting calcium for your bones from dairy foods, for many people now, even today, protein equals meat in so many people's minds. And so you have a brand new book all about the science and research behind eating and being nourished using plant based protein. Yes, plant powered protein. I love
Right.
it. And we will make sure to link to this book. I devoured it, pun intended. We will link to your book so that people can grab a copy for themselves. But I feel like we really need to go back and start with the very basics so people can really understand where the controversies that shouldn't be controversies, but where the controversies come from and like what it means to eat plant-based protein. So like what is protein?
Okay, well, protein is these long, long, long strings of amino acids. And the amino acids in our bodies actually all come from plants, every single one of them. And so we uh, can derive our protein from many different types of foods, but plants are certainly a primary source. And we we use protein for so many different reasons. It's a source for the antibodies that protect us against chronic disease. It's involved with enzymes that perform a lot of chemical reactions. It's involved in messenger proteins that send little messages, from your brain, move your finger, transport proteins that carry things. And then, of course, the ones we really think of, like our muscles and bones. Our bones have a lot of protein. It's kind of fun with little kids. Their bones are a lot protein, not so much of the minerals in proportion. And so when they fall down, they kind of bounce. Whereas when we're older, our bones are more minerals, and we really take care not to fall, but we still got protein in there. So anyway, proteins have all these uses, and we need about 20 different amino acids that build them. And you can get all these from plant foods, every single one.
And I think that's a really, there are so many things you just said that are important. But the first is that plants contain all of the amino acids. So, amino acids are these building blocks that get folded into proteins. And plants actually contain all of the amino acids we need, which then begs the question, how much protein do we need? And like, how would we know whether or not we're getting enough if we're not someone to count things? How would we know we're meeting our needs?
That's right. It's a really important one. And for one thing, mostly we are meeting our needs. For most people in North America, we easily get enough protein, and probably more than enough. And this includes vegans. Now, what we find is that we need officially, according to the recommendations, zero 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of healthy body weight. So for persons uh, above what might be considered their healthy body weight, they wouldn't need quite so much protein. And if they're under their healthy body weight, they could need a bit more than zero 0.8 grams per kilogram of their actual body weight. But that's our official recommendation. Now, when we think about plant-based eating, some of the foods go through a bit more when because we've got so much fiber. And so we actually add about 10% to those protein recommendations, making it like zero 0.9 grams per kilogram. And then there are special categories. For example, athletes that are building muscle, really increasing muscle, they need more protein. And their official recommendations, even up to 2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. And that's while we're adding muscle. Now, once you're an elite athlete or you've built your muscle up, you don't need those high levels, but while you're adding it. And another group that's interesting is seniors, because the official recommendations are not higher in Canada, but they're higher in Europe, in many places for seniors. So we're thinking about that because we don't absorb quite as well. So there are official recommendations, and then in our plant-powered protein book, we've given examples of how to do it at all these different stages of life.
And also remembering that that is not a lot. You know, zero 0.9, grams,
That's
it's
yeah.
not a lot. Like if you're lucky enough to put 3 meals a day on your table, if you have enough to eat, generally in North America, we're all far surpassing that.
That's right. That's right. Most people are. Now, there's just a very few people that don't. And for a while, I taught at this raw chef school in California. It was 100% raw foods. And it was interesting to me because uh, we didn't know that much about raw foods. And my publisher wanted me to publish a book on that. So I went down and worked with the staff at this school. And I found that people would eat these huge salads. I mean, really, really big. What you might think would be on your family table for a really big crowd would be one person. And they could get enough protein, barely, and they'd have to include nuts and seeds. But we find that a few people, like if they're on high fruit diets, fruitarian type of diets, they can be low. Or if they don't eat very much food, like if they're anorexic or they're senior with kind of dental problems and not really eating that much. So there's a few cases, but mostly we're easily getting enough. And there's great big studies, the Adventist Health Studies, for example, with over 90,000 people that have been conducted over decades. that show that the vegans are fine, the lacto-ovo vegetarians who include eggs and dairy are fine, and the non-vegetarians in these healthy populations are getting easily more than enough. And in the general public, they're getting almost twice what they need in terms of protein.
We really do have, I feel that protein is sort of the nutrient obsession du jour. Like it's all, we're very, very worried about protein, and food companies are using protein intake and requirements to like sort of market to us. And it's so funny because that even today, like every plant-based eater is very used to fielding questions about where we get our protein. Why do you think it is that most of us assume that protein equals meat, as opposed to
Oh,
just that protein is a nutrient found in food? I One of the things that I've talked to my community a little bit about, and I would love to hear your perspective on this, is the idea of whether or not the body can tell that it's getting protein for animal or plant sources.
oh, the body would not have any idea. There are a few things that are in the animal products, like we used to think of high saturated fat levels that are problematic. And there are things which we weren't thinking about, like production of TMAO that's linked to heart disease and new 5G that's linked to cancers. Now, these are in animal products, so those can be problematic. But the actual amino acids and protein and are just identical. In fact, the animals get their amino acids from plant foods down the food chain. We also know that there's great big animals: rhino, hippopotamus, gorilla, giraffe, cow, moose, horse, buffalo, that are plant based, and they have big muscles, big bones, and we similarly can do that. We can get our amino acids from plant foods directly.
Do you think that our sort of meat equals protein story is much like our calcium equals dairy story, that it's more of agricultural based marketing that has sort of cemented this idea in our head?
Well, we've nutrition's kind of fun as a science. I've been fascinated for many, many decades and evolved with it. My thinking evolved. And I this was before my time, but in World War I and two, people were kind of short of protein in World War II, for example, and after there was a thinking, and in the Depression, in that era, a chicken in every pot, like that was really something to look forward to. It was a big celebration. I've been in Nepal where people, the Sherpas that were carrying all our stuff, would have a chicken once a year. Like it was a really big deal, and they
Yeah.
think about it as something special. Now we've come a long way from that, so that we're absolutely overstuffed with these animal products. But we still have that kind of thinking that it was a good thing. The other sort of big point about this, which is different from the animal products and our thinking from the Depression era and World War II era. But we did research in the 1950s that was based on little animals that were rats. And there were a lot of rat studies done because, of course, we didn't want to test with humans, like starving them and giving them different things. So these little rats were given single foods. And they were done this when they were at the weanling stage. That's 4 weeks old. And we found that uh, at this stage, if they were given high protein foods like cheese or meat, they would do very well. They double their weight in 4 weeks. Now, that's not what people actually want to do, double their weight. Most of them want to go in the other direction. So that still, it made those foods look like really good foods, which they are good, suitable for rats. Rats also have particular needs for growing fur because they grow fur all over their bodies, and humans don't want to do that either. So it put us on this track thinking, okay, rats do well. We should get those kind of foods too. But it put us on a thinking track. And these animals only got one food. They didn't get, kind of a smorgasbord of different foods when they were doing these research studies. So a lot of our thinking has been based on rat studies, weanling rat studies that are doubling their weight in 4 weeks.
Well, and I think people would be surprised to know how many sort of foundational tenets of nutrition are based on really non ideal research that's just we've carried through with us. Similarly, the notion of protein quality, right? Starting with this idea of a complete protein, which I was taught in school. I graduated in 2006. And I was taught that if you are vegetarian, you need to make a complete protein. You need to put the rice and the beans on the plate at the same time in order to have that protein. What do we know now? Why has that changed?
that was an interesting one. And we found there was a book called Diet for a Small Planet in the early 70s that said you should do this food combining. And it was beans and grains. One was a little bit long in lysine and one was short in lysine, and you'd get this combination. And we found after 10 years, Frances Moore Lappé, who wrote that book, came out and said, whoops, I made a mistake. We don't have to do that. If you get the recommended intakes of protein and have a variety of foods, you're going to be fine. You don't need to carefully put, a cup of beans and 2 cups of rice. And we had all this really complicated thinking before that. But somehow the early message stuck and the new message of whoops did not stick.
And I
We
think,
find, yeah,
go ahead.
oh, we find that what is really important to tell people is to get a variety of plant foods. And that not only provides the mix of amino acids that we need, like all the individual plant foods actually have all the amino acids, but they're in slightly different proportions from food to food. But if you get a mix of plant foods, and we show this on our food guides that are on our websites, like Plant Powered Protein and also becomingvegan.ca.
Mm.
We've got food guides there, and you can see a mix, and it's about half the plate is vegetables and fruits. Now, it happens that the Canada Food Guide is very, very similar to this. In fact, they used our Becoming Vegan Comprehensive Edition. It was in their office while they were developing the food guide. And the Canada Food Guide includes animal products as well, but it's a very similar pattern. And so we've got half is fruits and vegetables. It's fine if that's a little bit more than half. And then a quarter is whole grains and other grain products. And a little sliver is nuts and seeds. And almost a quarter is protein foods. The protein foods that we're talking about are the legumes, the beans, peas, lentils, the soy foods. And on the Canada Food Guide, they include eggs and meat and cheese and dairy products in that little quarter, less than a quarter.
And I think that's so important for people to see that regardless if you are plant based or if you consider yourself an omnivore, the basics of healthy eating are exactly the same. And it is merely the foods you choose to fill those slots, which really, I mean, the fruits and vegetables, that's for all of us. The whole grains, that's for all of us. It really just comes down to what do you choose for your proteins?
And these food guides have been very carefully thought through because we're not only thinking about getting enough protein, but we want to get all the different vitamins, the minerals, about 30 different nutrients, the omega-3 fatty acids. We want to get a mix. And these food guides have been very carefully worked out to provide that. So we've got good guidance here.
And I think that, it really, people will often look at this very seemingly simple guidance and perhaps gloss over it and look for something with a sexier hook, for example. But the amount of work, the amount of research, and the amount of clinical expertise that goes into saying, hey guys, actually, put a quarter, fill a quarter of your plate with some plant based protein is the most profound thing that you can do for your health. Just following that plate method and getting those variety of foods, like that is 9/10 of the efforts towards being a healthier person.
That's right. Yeah. And if we get on that wavelength, I have clients that come and they're just trying to figure out, okay, how would I do that at breakfast? How would I do that at lunch? How can I make it really simple? Or some of them are more gourmet, and how can I make that really elegant when my family comes over? You
Yeah.
know, but it's really possible. And I find that people don't need to change really a lot. We often have about 10 recipes that we use, but if you're doing a transition, you just need to learn a few new recipes, things that you can get easily at the store, you like making, and your family likes the taste of them. And then, yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Good. Done.
And I find that, definitely when you're making the transition to a more plant based protein life, getting those recipes, those flavors, those recipes that you love is so critical. The other thing that I see is that sometimes folks will underestimate how much they need to eat in order to get certain nutrients. So, like a great example is it's very entrenched that quinoa contains protein. So, people will throw a little sprinkle of quinoa on their salad and be like, whoop, there's all my protein for the day. Like, how much of certain foods, whether it is legumes or nuts or tofu, is a reasonable serving when we're relying on it for our protein?
Okay, well, we think of a serving as being, say, for legumes, somewhere between a cup and half a cup, kind of depending on how big your body is and whether you're having other sources. But I always try for at least half a cup of beans, peas, lentils, or tofu at lunch and at supper. And I put hemp seeds in my smoothie in the morning. And that seems to work very well. I've got a picture here. This is gado gado, and it's got some tempeh in the middle, and then lots of veggies, and so you can have a beautiful mix. And with the soy foods, they're such little protein powerhouses that you can manage with like half a cup. And one of the things I've really liked to do is marinate some tofu cubes, put them in the air fryer, and have those around also as snack foods. So if people don't eat quite so much at lunch, they can have a little mid-afternoon snack of these marinated tofu cubes that are just delicious.
I love that you have an air fryer. I feel like I am the last person on earth to not have an air fryer.
Oh, they're great. We got ours by accident at one of those Christmas, when people have gift exchanges and you steal presents from each other. So, and so we ended up with this air fryer, which we didn't even know what it was going to do, but it's great. It's really good. And so with the marinated tofu, it allows you to get past the frying. You know, we're trying to back off on so much oil and so much fried foods, when we go to for more whole food plant based. And so with the air fryer, you've just got this wonderful taste, and it cooks up in about 14 minutes. You just stick all your little tofu cubes in the basket of the air fryer, and there you are. And it stops when it's ready. I always like these appliances that will stop when you finish the timer, the Instant Pot too, because I could go off and do something else and forget about it, and it's done on time. So air fryers are quite fun. We've appreciated ours.
I need to pick one up. Okay, so when it comes to things like tofu, tempeh, or legumes, at least a half a cup, maybe a cup, depending on your body size, your energy levels. What about foods like nuts and nut butters and seeds?
Well, I found those are, instead of eating fats like, we've thought olive oil was healthy, which oil's healthy, is coconut oil healthy? Well, you're much better to go to seeds and nuts. And seeds are even higher in protein than nuts are. So something like hemp seeds, they're over 20% of the calories from protein. And they're a good little thing to add, like to smoothies or to breakfast cereals. If you have oatmeal, put a few tablespoons, and then you get your protein, and you also get omega-3 fatty acids. So I like to think about what nuts and seeds also deliver. They're good protein sources, especially the seeds, and the cashews, for example, have zinc, and that's good for the immune system. It's also involved with sperm. And, there's lots of little reasons we need zinc. And pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds have zinc too. And then some of the seeds have calcium. Tahini from sesame seeds has calcium, so do almonds. And so there are additional bonuses to having the nuts and seeds, and they can be a handy little snack too. So nuts and seeds are pretty valuable. So you get the fat, which is actually an important part of your diet, but you also have these other nutrients delivered as well.
I love that. I feel that seeds are the underrated or overlooked cousin of nuts. We all think about cashews or almonds or peanuts, but hemp hearts, chia seeds, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, those are all very nutrient dense foods.
They are, and pistachios too. They're another little protein food. So these are really fun to have, and they're good snacks. Like if you're choosing a snack, I used to choose potato chips. I love them, but now I go for seeds and nuts, or maybe some nut butter, almond butter, or that I'm moving more towards the seeds that are grown in Canada, like the hemp seeds, the pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, because we're finding when we start thinking environmentally and concerned with climate change and so on, we're finding that almonds take a lot of water. So I've been kind of moving from um, the seeds that are grown that take, or nuts that take a lot of water, to some of the seeds that are better
I
on
love
the
hemp.
climate change.
I love hemp
Yeah, they're good.
hearts. They're so
Yeah,
good. And, 3 tablespoons has 10 grams of protein. So I find that I recommend them often to people who want to boost protein in a smoothie, for example, but would like to not do a protein powder. People don't realize my sort of magic combination right now is a cup of soy milk, again, a very underrated food with like seven
yeah,
to 8 grams of protein, plus three
yeah.
tablespoons of hemp hearts. That's almost 18 grams of protein, roughly equivalent to a lot of protein powders out there, and all whole foods so that you get like all of the other nutrition that goes with it.
That's right. And that's as much protein as a burger. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really good. Yeah, that's what I have, the hemp hearts in my smoothie every morning too, and they're a good Canadian product. Yeah,
It's true. Choosing local foods whenever we can is so important. Okay. I do love
yeah,
that you talked about the why in terms of shifting to plant based protein in the book. So, animal agriculture, obviously, so many of us are vegan for the animals, but there's another side of that in terms of actually talking about climate change and the impact of animal agriculture on climate change. Because, just as you said, too, almonds have become very famous for the amount of water they're grown in the beautiful and very, very dry and very hot Central Valley. Water is an issue in that part of the world. Sometimes soy is labeled as unsustainable, but in your book, you talk about the actual impact of different proteins on climate change. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
that's right. This was a really new area for a lot of us to think about diet, because we thought about transportation as being important, but I find a lot of the environmentalists are going, "What? Diet too?" Like, and it's as important as transportation, in some calculations even more. So we have a chapter about the environmental costs of your different dietary choices. And we have, for example, this is a chart which you won't be able to see the details, but it shows that the costs in terms of CO2 emissions for beef, when you look at the whole production line, are 20 times that of tofu. Now, people wonder about, soy foods and tofu. Well, that has to be grown with water and so on. But when you look at how much of that fodder is shipped and sent to where cows are raised, or chickens or pigs, or, all sorts of different animals, and you look at the various stages of production and water use at each stage and transportation costs. And there's a man named Joseph Poor, based in Oxford, who took 5 years to write a paper. And his website's josephpoor.com. It's very interesting. He just did another talk recently, and you can see his talks linked on that website. But he looked at all stages of production from beginning to end and made calculations. He worked with another Swiss scientist. And then he took a year off Oxford to write his paper. And they looked at thousands of different agricultural situations. So these figures, like 20 to 1 for beef, comparing beef to tofu in its CO2 emissions, that was based not on one farm, but on thousands of farms, and is an average. So a few farmers are doing better. They're being really careful. They still, of course, can't get it down to the same level as the plant foods, because you've got fodder involved, even at the fattening up stage. But there's on average this 20 to 1 difference. We also find that he looked at land use, land acidification. By the hog farms in Manitoba, there's very acid areas, and that happens whenever there's a lot of manure. Water use and water pollution. So we looked at these 5 different areas and found always that the plant foods were far lower in terms of their environmental damage and impact compared to the animal products.
And I think that's such an eye-opening piece of information for people, because I think we're used to many times where there's all of these things that we're being told about climate change, and yet it feels like there's very little that we can do personally to make an impact, because industries are causing a lot of these things. Whereas when it comes to our diet,
Yeah,
making these choices on our plate has a very real impact on the sustainability of our food system and on climate change for decades to come.
that's right. It's a huge difference. And the other thing is that people sometimes want the government to do something about it. But actually, we need to do something about it ourselves. We need to be choosing electric vehicles if we can manage that, or riding your bike or taking public transport. But we also need to be choosing going more plant-based, and finding out ways to make it taste good and be fun for your kids, and just making it work.
What do you think for people who are transitioning? So people who hear this and they've been making steps and they're like, wow, I really need to go further in this direction. Like, what are some tips for people who are, trying to make the change? Like, what do they need to be successful?
Okay, well, um, one thing is our books are mostly in the library, so you can go and have a look at Becoming Vegan, Express Edition or Comprehensive Edition, or look for this new plant powered protein book. That can help to give confidence. Or dietitians such as yourself or me do consultations with people, and sometimes that's covered by extended medical as well. And we can really help you give a confidence. And I find that a lot of times, like, people are going through pregnancy, beginning, the mom and the dad will come and like, I don't know if we should do it this way because I'm not that sure. And then you give them a confidence. And sometimes, often, people are doing it really well already. And they'll go, oh, good, that's all right then, you know. So that's one thing. You can just make sure that you learn more about getting it right. And look at these food guides on our becomingvegan.ca site or the Plant Power Protein site. And then the next thing is to try and build your food, your whole way of eating towards plant foods. Even you don't have to go 100% plant foods. Like the research will give you good feedback that you're doing well if you're just eating little bits of animal products, but a lot of plant foods. So you can be confident, you know, that you or your family are okay at that stage. And then you start finding ways to make it taste good. And when you go to the store, you can go down some different aisles, look at the things that there are. Once I did a workshop for people and we were trying out veggie burgers. I think we had 10 kinds of veggie burgers. And there are all kinds of different ones. Like there's some that are based on whole foods like black beans and quinoa and grains, and some that are quite processed and have a very meat-like taste. And sometimes, like if your father-in-law is coming over and he wouldn't be that comfortable eating something that didn't taste like meat pretty close, you can try Impossible Burgers, and Beyond Burgers are a little bit more in the Whole Foods natural. So anyway, there's lots of choices and they're coming out thick and fast. Another one that you mentioned is when you look at the non-dairy milks that you're using, have a look at the label and see how much protein there is. For example, a rice milk, you know, almond milk, those have just 1 gram of protein per cup, which is pretty low. And the companies that produce these, for example, soy milk, they're in the 6 to 8 grams of protein per cup, just up there with cow's milk. And other companies are realizing that we are looking at those labels. We want protein delivered in our non-dairy milk. And so some are adding hemp seeds to it. Some are, there's oat milks that have other things added, and or a mix of different plant foods. So anyway, it's kind of fun to see these products, but they're coming out fast because companies are realizing that we, the consumers, are paying attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I further to what you just said, when you are exploring all of these new things, you know, there are so many veggie burgers out there. The first one you eat, if you don't like it, that's just one. There are so many more to try. Don't think that the first milk that you try or the first burger that you try is how all of them will taste. Like, really be adventurous and put your, like, you know, experiment hat on, and we're going to see like which one is the best for us.
That's right. Yeah. So what are your favorite that you might have for lunch or supper? What are some fun meals?
So I do, you know, for burgers I do make some of my own, but I have to admit my kiddos love a Beyond Meat burger the best. They do like the beef like burger the best. I like making them with black beans. I just like the texture of black beans in burgers, and chickpeas in burgers. But we eat a lot of smoked tofu around here.
Uh-huh.
I love
Oh, and there's some new companies coming out with those.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
just love that it's ready to eat. So you can slice it like a cheese and put it on, like my littlest likes, snack plates. So you can do some whole grain crackers and some smoked tofu and some fruits and some vegetables. She just wants everything separate. And so, you know,
Oh, yeah.
they will eat that and be so happy. So we eat a lot of smoked tofu. I will do a lot of, you know, roasted tofu or even tofu crumbles. Like, I just developed a recipe for tacos where it's like a bunch of, you know, seasonings to make like a sort of traditional taco spice. But then you bake the tofu crumbles and it just gets such a nice texture.
Wow, that sounds good. I think when my kids were growing up, my kids are in their 50s now, and when they were growing up, we had tacos a lot because people could choose what they wanted and they could pile it in. And at that point, we were a partly vegetarian, partly not family. And so you could accommodate a lot of different kinds of eaters. Now we find that there's so many really pretty plant foods. You can have a fun table for taco assembly that has avocados and tomatoes and crumbles and black beans and just all kinds of fun things. So that was a delightful meal to have with the family.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And I think in terms of, because same thing, I have a mixed family. I only cook plants, but my family also eats other things. And so making sure that I keep them satisfied on a plant-based diet, I'm always, racking my brain for new ideas. And I think that's a big part of being successful is truly loving what you eat. This is not about depriving yourself. In 2023, anything you can dream up can be made with plants.
That's right. Yeah. Another thing that I think is good with kids, and of course now I've got grandchildren, but the children that come home from school hungry, if you just put out a big platter of veggies and hummus and some whole grain crackers and leave it on the counter, don't talk about eating plant foods, it'll be so gobbled up by dinner time that you won't mind what they're eating, enough protein or vegetables, because it'll have disappeared from that tray. But those are things that people really like. And I've got a grandson, one of those kids that likes everything to be beige or white or maybe orange if it's cheese, but really limited. And I found that hummus really worked for him. So that's a good protein thing.
I love that. I want to get your perspective on, particularly on social media right now. There's a little bit of a trend emerging of people who used to be vegan and are claiming that after they've returned to meat consumption, their health has improved. And now, as dietitians, we need to respect that we have no idea what is actually going on for this person. We don't know their backgrounds, we don't know how they were eating. We all have to do what is right for us. However, I want to ask you, because this is such a trend, what are some of the reasons why people may feel better if they reintroduce meat? Like, is it under eating in general? Is it focusing too much on fruits and vegetables? Like, what are some of the dietary patterns or habits that could lead you to feel perhaps less unwell on plants? Obviously, everything is fixable, but I would just love to get to your perspective on that.
Well, I think putting together an optimal diet, you got to learn some stuff on any eating pattern. And so sometimes people, for example, are not getting enough omega-3 fatty acids when they're eating only plant foods. And we can get those from plants. Actually, even fish get their omega-3s from algae. They don't make them. And so we can have either use things like flaxseed, hemp seed, chia, walnuts to get our omega-3s, or use a supplement that's from algae that provides DHA and EPA. So that's one thing that I find sometimes people don't get it right, and then they want to go back to eating fish, which is an option, but we're finding that problematic because the long term is that those fish are getting so polluted now. So there's a lot of trade-offs here. I don't find that many people who really have a problem um, eating a plant-based diet, but sometimes they just haven't learned, for example, how to make tofu taste good, or and people can have problems like legumes being sensitive to certain legumes. There's about 20 kinds of legumes, so people might have an allergy, or they might have tried undercooked kidney beans and then had gastric problems with that. Well, actually there's 20 kinds of legumes. Red lentils, some other of the legumes are very easily digested. So there's differences here. And when people are concerned, am I doing it right? Am I getting enough? We sometimes have to go over these things, when I'm working with clients and helping them to get it right. Now, people will also have a lot of health problems if they eat too much meat. There's huge health problems. So that's what I'm seeing more of. I was recently talking in Chilliwack at the Women's Expo, and I was kind of wondering what it would be like out there because it's all dairy farmers, chicken farmers, you know, uh, pig farmers, and I didn't know what they'd think of a booth with plant-based books. But so many of the people came by and said, "Oh, this is interesting because I've been developing type 2 diabetes, or my husband has heart disease, or my grandson's gone vegan." So, even in all sorts of different areas, we're finding that people are shifting towards plant foods. And it can be something to learn to get it right. I guess you're helping people, Desiree, right? When they come to you and wonder.
Yeah. Well, and it's very much, and I wanted to get your perspective on it, but it's very much my purview that when you're not feeling well, something is wrong with the nutrition. It's the nutrition. It's not where you get the nutrition from. It's the nutrition itself. Like as an example, when a meat eater gets anemia, no one says, "Oh, well, it's because you're an omnivore." But, if
Right.
someone is feeling fatigued, people will immediately say it's because you're vegan, not, "Oh, you're neglecting protein," or, "Oh, maybe your iron is low." Like immediately the diet becomes the blame as opposed to this micro piece that we're all human. We don't always eat perfectly nutritionally balanced, but we always sort of like label the vegan, whereas we don't label the omnivore for the same issue.
Good points. One of the things about iron that's interesting is that a lot of us who are on plant based diets have somewhat lower serum ferritin. And this can actually be a good thing. What we found out more recently, and sometimes doctors don't even know this, or labs might have not thought it through very carefully, but we need hemoglobin to be, that's our working iron. That's carrying the oxygen around the carbon dioxide. That's working really hard. But on the shelf is ferritin sitting waiting to be used sometime. And that iron is a pro-oxidant. It can cause oxidation, kind of like rusting. And so we found that you really don't need very high serum ferritin. In fact, it's been linked to certain chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, and so on. And so I'm finding that when people's ferritin looks a bit low, but they're feeling fine and their hemoglobin's fine, they needn't worry about it. That it's actually not a bad thing. We also find that there are not more anemic vegans and vegetarians than there are omnivores. Like this is just something that happens, particularly to women of childbearing age who are losing iron monthly in their menstrual periods. You got to be eating iron-rich foods, and those are the beans, the tofu, the 20 kinds of legumes. Those are really good iron sources.
I have never heard it described like that. And that makes it so clear, the idea that hemoglobin is your working iron and ferritin is on the shelf waiting to be used. That's brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I got kind of interested because I kept having clients who said my ferritins, it's not below normal, but it's kind of at the low end of the normal range. And my hemoglobin is fine and I'm feeling fine. So I really looked into it a lot. And the research about that is fairly recent. So a lot of MDs even aren't aware of that difference. And so people have had that pointed out to them and said, are you doing okay? Your doctor wonders about, maybe you should eat a bit of meat and get back up there again. And that's not a wise idea because you'll be increasing your risk of chronic disease.
So let's talk about that then. Sort of in the moment, acute issues aside, long term. Like, what is our data to support long-term health on a plant-based diet and chronic disease outcomes?
Okay, well, we're finding that you can reduce your risk of the big chronic diseases by, say, for hypertension, by about 75% by going plant-based. That's huge.
That's huge.
Actually, yeah, my husband, when I met him, he had hypertension, was taking pills and stuff, and within a year he was off all the pills and he was fine. He was very well. If you look at cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, you see about a 66% drop in risk when you go plant-based. And these are based on very big studies and with population groups that had otherwise healthy lifestyles, like they did some exercise, they, didn't eat a lot of meat, but still, when they went entirely plant-based, they dropped their risk of chronic disease. The Adventist Health Studies, which involved over 90,000 people, over decades have been very helpful for that. And then there's the Epic Oxford studies, where again they had large population groups, about 30,000, and lots of vegans, and they'd watch their risk of chronic disease. They'd follow these people for years and years and years, and what is happening health wise to you. And so we've been very fortunate to have these studies where we could really see, yeah, what you choose to eat matters. We're finding also with cancers that you can reduce your risk of chronic disease. It's different for different types of cancer. And of course, cancer is very complex. There's so many causes, but we can drop a risk of, say, bowel, intestinal type cancers by 50%. And of some of the other kinds, like in the range of like 15, 19% by going plant based.
Which is amazing. So rarely in nutrition do we have such large scale data, long term, high population to show us that, if you eat a certain way, this is what can happen. And so I really hope that, hearing this, people realize that plant based eating isn't some fad, it's so strongly grounded in the research.
And people are starting to realize that first. I know when I went first plant based in the late 70s, that was in India, and I could see that the people were doing fine on plant based diets. But when we in the early 90s, when I went vegan, we were really wondering, is this going to work? But it does work. It works. I know for myself, I'm 81, and this last year, I did a little mini triathlon, and the Stanley Park one. I want to do my swimming
Amazing.
separately in a pool. Yeah, but I think I want to see a lot of really healthy old plant-based eaters, just as good examples for how we can do it. And we're getting more and more along this lines. You can feel good, your brain's still working well, you're fit, You have to do a combination of fitness and do some exercise, the various types of exercise each day, and um, you need to eat more plant-based, make sure you're getting the nutrients you need, have a nice social connections, and then it really works. Get enough sleep.
Yeah.
Those are the little combinations.
I cannot think of a more glowing example than you at 81 doing a mini triathlon for the plant-based diet. If you need any other, you know, um, proof of concept, you are it. I want to ask you one more question before we shift to the rapid fire questions. That is very
Okay.
much in line with age, because of course we are all getting older, and there's a lot of conversation around the perimenopausal and menopausal shift in women, but also then how to stay strong and healthy as we move into our elder years. How does protein fit into that? You mentioned that our protein needs change somewhat as we get older. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, we sure don't have a lot of research. What we have, and I was actually just connecting with a researcher who's working on this in Brazil, and there's some in Europe, some different studies. But we find that you do need somewhat more protein when you're a senior. And what happens to a lot of people is that they develop sarcopenia or lose muscle mass when they get older. And there's a couple of reasons. Not doing exercise is one, and not getting enough protein. You know, there was that tea and toast syndrome that we used to think of for seniors. And there can be challenges like dental, like it's hard to eat something tough, hard to eat meat, that kind of thing. And so people just back off and have more soft things and tea and toast. Well, it turns out tofu is actually a pretty good thing dentally. It is soft, and you can get different forms of it, put it in smoothies, have these tofu fingers, that kind of thing. But we need possibly, instead of zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, as much as 1.2, 1.1 or 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. And so when I've tried to think of how to do that for a senior who, say in a home who wasn't feeling that good and didn't want to eat very much, that sometimes the protein powders can be helpful. The branched chain amino acids, or ones that have leucine in them, that athletes use for muscle building, they can be good for seniors too, like to put in a smoothie. So that's one option. Now, I like the whole foods approach. So I make sure, like, I just had black bean soup for lunch, and I'll have some tempeh that was marinated for supper. I've just been learning how to make tempeh taste good. And so anyway, these are really important things to include as we get older. Um, let's see, what else?
I think that's, a great place to start, particularly, and if someone is taking care of an elder parent or a grandparent, thinking about swallowing issues can come up too, in addition to their ability to chew, but swallowing issues as well. Because
Right.
instantly I think of a smoothie, like put a protein powder in a smoothie, but sometimes it doesn't work with swallowing.
That's right. And I've also connected once with a nursing home. I had a senior living in one, and she wanted to be vegetarian. She wanted to be plant-based, but that wasn't on the usual menu for the care facility. And so she got me to help with the chef in the kitchen. What could they do? Those chefs are working really hard, and they've got lots of people to cater to. And so we figured out some meals that she could have that were very, very easy, and could provide the protein that was needed, and be on her plate at lunchtime. And some of the care facilities actually have very good plant-based meals
Yeah.
as well. I worked with some of the Adventist ones, and it's good checking, for a senior, that when they're considering which place to go, what kind of menus they have. And usually most institutions now are developing good menus that are plant-based.
So much better than it used to be. And you mentioned the loss of appetite too, which can be an issue. I mean, even myself, and I'm just 43. I notice that my appetite is less than it was just a decade ago. And recognizing then that if you're fully plant based, focusing on that protein, making sure that that becomes a little bit of a hero on the plate. You do a lentil dal with some vegetables and focus on eating maybe more of that than the starches on the side, just to get that extra protein in if you find that your appetite is low.
And we don't have a lot of room for junk. We really don't. Like, I see people spending their money and their calories on things like pop, soda pop, just sugar. That's just a waste. And even potato chips that I just love.
Me too.
I don't keep them in the house at all. I'd rather have some little tofu crumbles, that kind of thing. And they can taste salty and have a bit of a nip or whatever, or some pistachios, that kind of thing for treats are much, much better. So you don't have a lot to waste, a lot of calories to waste.
I love that. Okay, let's shift into some fun rapid fire questions. The first is, what is one thing you wish everybody knew about going vegan?
Oh, that it can taste really good. Can really taste good. I've had fun when we developed our books. So one in the library is called Cooking Vegetarian or Cooking Vegan. I did it with a chef from the Four Seasons, and I'm a dietitian. We didn't learn about taste; we learned about nutrition. So I've had fun always when we were developed our recipes that we had people who had a good sense of taste and much more fine tuned than mine was. And so that's good, and it can be simple.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, next up, just a silly one. You have to choose only one, rice or pasta. What do you choose?
Um, I choose one day and one the next day.
Cheating.
No, they're both good, And when it's my grandson coming over, I'll choose pasta.
Okay, this one is a mean one, I admit it. What is your
Okay.
favorite plant based protein? You get to choose just one.
Oh, it is definitely these little um, tofu fingers, marinated tofu. It's really good. So I have a neighbor gave me this recipe. I'll tell you what's in it.
Okay.
It's in our book, Plant Power Protein. So it's got um, toasted sesame oil, a little bit, low sodium tamari, rice vinegar, a little bit, and ginger and a bit of garlic. And so the tofu is chopped up in little pieces. I get firm tofu, chop it up in little cubes that are about a centimeter, and put it in that marinade, and then let it sit there. And it could be there for 3 days even. So I might have it had it just in for 2 hours, and then put it in the air fryer. So it's always kind of ready, sitting there, ready to be air fried.
Oh, I love
And that's an easy one. Now I do like red lentil dal too. That's second.
that. Perfect. Okay, I'll permit a second.
Okay,
Next
thank
up,
you.
do you have a hidden talent or a fun hobby? I mean, you've already told us that you do mini triathlons. What else?
Um, I I listen to books, audiobooks.
Oh,
There's this app that I have on my phone called Libby app, and you can get any book you want that's in the library system, and even broader than the Vancouver Library. And you can listen to stories, or there's a good one that I listened to recently about the body, and it, they're just fascinating things. And you can listen as an audiobook, and I have some that I listen to when I want to fall asleep. They're like little stories that you know what's going to happen by the end, and it's kind of relaxing. And some that are for gaining information. But Libby app is great because
amazing.
it's free. You get to listen to all this stuff. It can be very relaxing, like having a bedtime story told by your dad, and you fall asleep. So it's a good one.
I love that. I'm going to put that in the show notes so that everyone can check it out. Okay, final one. It's a bit of a signature question. I love asking people this, but you find yourself with 20 extra minutes. You're not allowed to be productive. You can't work. You can't do anything around the home. What do you do with 20 extra minutes all to yourself?
Um, let's see. Well, I do walk around Trout Lake every morning.
Mm,
That's 20 minutes.
perfect.
Um, I live in co-housing. So this is like a community. It's a Danish concept. We have 31 households. So I can just walk out the door and see what's going in our courtyard. We had a lot of music through COVID. It's called Vancouver Co-housing. Co-housing is quite fun. It's a really delight.
Amazing. I feel like we need to explore that more, maybe in another conversation. Vesanto, thank you so much for taking your time and sharing all of your knowledge with us on the Allsorts podcast. I know that people will take a lot away from this conversation.
Thank you, Desiree. It's such a delight to connect. Yeah.